Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're looking at passive investing.
Okay.
Specifically, an article from the Eighth Wonder Capital Substack, it's called In Flux, is the popularity of passive investing a boon or a bane?
Interesting.
And the author is this guy, Mr. Schmidt, who brings a computer science perspective. I think that's what makes this piece so interesting.
Yeah, definitely.
I've always just thought about passive investing as
Ah,
set it and forget it, put your money in an ETF and just kind of ride the waves.
right.
But this article is making me rethink that, especially when we start thinking about what happens when the market crashes.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
So passive investing has gotten super popular. But as more and more people jump on board, are we creating like a vulnerability?
For sure. I think that's worth exploring.
Okay, so the author starts us by comparing the stock market to a complex adaptive system, like an ant colony,
Okay, interesting.
with millions of investors all interacting and reacting and creating these unpredictable patterns.
Right.
So what's the significance of this comparison when we think about passive investing?
Well, the interesting thing here is that this unpredictability, it can lead to some pretty surprising outcomes. You see, a strategy might seem totally sensible for like an individual, but if everyone starts doing the same thing at the same time, it can actually backfire in a big way.
Like how?
Well, let's go back to the 1987 Black Monday crash.
Okay.
One of the things that contributed to that was this strategy called portfolio insurance.
Portfolio insurance.
Sounds like a good thing, right?
Yeah, like a safety net.
Exactly. The idea was to limit losses during a market downturn. But here's the thing, when the market started to drop and everyone tried to use this portfolio insurance, at the same time, it triggered this massive sell-off.
Oh, wow.
And that actually amplified the crash.
So instead of preventing the crash, it made it worse.
Exactly. It's kind of like a stampede. What might make sense for one person can turn into a disaster when everyone does it.
So are we seeing a similar kind of stampede dynamic with passive investing today?
That's what Mr. Schmidt is getting at, with the huge amount of money flowing into index tracking ETFs. It's possible that this collective behavior could create those same vulnerabilities.
So it's like those positive feedback loops, where the popularity of something drives up demand, which then attracts even more people,
Exactly.
and eventually you get a bubble.
And we see that all the time, right?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Not just in finance. Like, think about fashion trends or
Oh, yeah.
social media challenges. Everyone wants to be in on the in thing. And that just fuels the growth even more.
So in the stock market, that can lead to like irrational exuberance, where prices get totally detached from actual value.
Yeah, and then when sentiment shifts, you get that stampede for the exits.
So what is it about passive investing that makes it so vulnerable to these feedback loops?
Well, let's think about how ETFs work for a second. They're designed to track an index.
Right, like the S&P 500.
Exactly. So when the weighting of a company in that index changes, the ETF has to adjust its holdings to match it.
Okay, I'm following.
So let's say a company's stock price skyrockets and its weighting in the index goes up.
The ETF would need to buy more shares of that company, even if the price is already crazy high.
Exactly.
Wow. So if this is happening on a larger scale, with lots of ETFs all tracking the same index and having to rebalance at the same time, that could really exaggerate market movements.
Right, and potentially create those boom and bust cycles.
So it seems like passive investing in a way is actually adding more complexity to the market,
Yeah.
even though it's supposed to be all about simplifying things.
Yeah, it's a bit of a paradox.
Should the average investor be worried about this?
I wouldn't say worried, but definitely aware. Every investment strategy has its nuances and potential downsides.
That's true.
It's about understanding how these mechanisms work so you can make informed decisions.
So what happens when the music stops
Hmm.
and everybody wants to get out of passive investments at the same time?
That's where things could get really interesting.
Okay, before we get into that, let's recap. So we've talked about how the stock market is this complex adaptive system with all these investors interacting, and sometimes those actions can have some unintended consequences.
Right.
And then we talked about how the popularity of passive investing, while it has its benefits, could be creating some vulnerabilities because of the way ETFs work and the potential for these feedback loops. So now I want to hear what happens when a huge number of investors decide to pull their money out of passive investments all at once.
Let's explore that. Imagine a scenario where you have a lot of investors, maybe baby boomers, getting ready for retirement, and they all start withdrawing from their ETF holdings to fund their golden years.
Okay, what happens then?
Well, the ETFs, they have to sell off their holdings to meet those redemptions.
Right.
But here's the key thing. If everyone is selling and very few people are buying, prices are going to fall. And since ETFs have to track the index, They're forced to sell even if it means taking a loss.
So it's not just individual investors selling off their shares. It's the ETFs themselves becoming forced sellers.
Exactly, and that can really accelerate the downturn.
So it's like that stampede analogy again. What seems like a perfectly reasonable decision for one person, like I need to access my retirement savings, can turn into this cascading effect when it's happening across millions of investors.
It becomes this vicious cycle. Falling prices scare more investors, leading to more selling, which drives prices down even further.
Sounds like a recipe for a market crash.
That's the concern. And what's really interesting here is that this crash wouldn't necessarily be driven by fundamentals, like a bad economy or poor company performance. It would be driven by the mechanics of passive investing itself.
So in a way, passive investing is making the market more fragile.
That's a perspective worth considering for sure.
So how should investors think about passive investing given these potential risks? Should they just avoid it altogether?
I wouldn't say that every investment strategy has its pros and cons.
Yep.
The important thing is awareness. By understanding the potential downsides, you can make more informed decisions about how passive investing fits into your overall strategy.
So knowledge is power.
Exactly.
It sounds like passive investing isn't just the set it and forget it solution that a lot of people think it is.
That's a good way to put it.
It's more complicated than that.
Just like with any investment, it's important to stay informed, assess the risks, and make sure your portfolio is aligned with your goals.
This has been a really eye-opening discussion, but we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
So let's take a quick break, and then we'll come back to explore some ways to manage these risks
Sounds good.
and navigate the world of passive investing with a little more awareness.
See you on the other side.
Okay, so we're back, and I think it's time to really dig into those everybody's running for the exits moments. Like, what happens when a ton of investors, like let's say baby boomers getting ready for retirement, they decide to cash out their ETFs all at the same time?
Right. Well, you have to think about it. When everyone's selling and no one's buying, prices are going to drop. It's basic economics. And because ETFs are designed to track their index, they're forced to sell their holdings, even if it means losing money.
So it's not just individual investors hitting that sell button. It's the ETFs themselves becoming forced sellers.
Exactly. And that just amplifies the whole thing.
This is a little scary, honestly.
It's definitely something to consider. And what makes it even more interesting is that this kind of crash scenario, it wouldn't necessarily be triggered by like a weak economy or bad company earnings. It would be driven by the mechanics of passive investing itself.
So we've established that passive investing can actually introduce new complexities into the market, even though it's supposed to be all about simplicity.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic, isn't it?
But you mentioned earlier that knowledge is power. So what are some concrete steps that investors can take to manage these risks?
Well, the first thing is diversification. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Instead of just focusing on an S&P 500 ETF, you might consider diversifying across different asset classes or sectors or geographies.
So spreading the risk around, what else?
Timing is also important. If you're investing for the long haul, like for retirement, short-term market fluctuations shouldn't matter as much.
Okay, so don't panic sell.
Exactly.
But what if you're closer to retirement and you might need to access those funds sooner?
That's when a solid withdrawal plan is crucial. You might gradually shift into less volatile investments as you approach retirement, just to kind of buffer yourself from those sudden market drops.
This is all really helpful. So awareness and being proactive are key.
For sure.
But there's one more thing I wanted to touch on. Mr. Schmidt, the author of the article, he brings up this really interesting idea about maybe trying to predict when those ETF rebalancing events might happen, and then using that information to your advantage.
Wow, that's a fascinating concept. The stock market is this giant data processing machine. It's constantly generating information and responding to events. So in theory, if you could access and analyze the right data, you might be able to get some insights into how ETFs are going to behave.
So it's like trying to crack the code, find those hidden patterns.
Yeah, it would be quite a challenge. You'd need a deep understanding of how ETFs work and the market forces at play.
That seems beyond most individual investors. But the point is that these hidden relationships and patterns, they do exist. And they might become even more pronounced as passive investing keeps growing.
They're right.
So maybe there are some opportunities for those who are willing to do the research.
Maybe, but remember, the market is unpredictable. There are no guarantees, and every strategy has its risks.
So we can analyze all the data we want, but we can't control what the market ultimately does.
And that takes us back to our original point. The stock market is this complex, adaptive system,
It's like a living, breathing thing.
constantly evolving and surprising us.
So humbling and yet exciting at the same time.
There's always something new to learn and new possibilities to explore.
I totally agree. Well, this has been a really insightful conversation about passive investing. Before we wrap up, what are the key takeaways you'd like listeners to remember?
I think the most important thing is awareness. Passive investing has become hugely popular and it has its benefits, but we need to be aware of the potential downsides, especially the systemic risks.
Okay, so knowledge is power.
Exactly, the more you understand how the market works, the better equipped you'll be to make smart decisions.
And to navigate this ever-changing world of investing.
That's right.
That's great advice. Never stop learning. That's a great motto for anything, really.
I agree.
Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We've explored the ins and outs of passive investing, uncovered some potential risks, and hopefully given you the knowledge to make more informed decisions.
It's been my pleasure.
Remember, the best investment you can make is in your own knowledge and understanding.
Absolutely.
So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep. As we wrap up our deep dive, I'm feeling excited, but also a little cautious. Passive investing, and especially ETFs, they've totally changed how we invest.
For sure.
But like we've been talking about, there are these kind of hidden things we need to watch out for.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's not just set it and forget it. It's a powerful tool, but you got to understand how it works.
Right? We've talked about how those ETF rebalancing events and those moments when everybody wants to sell at the same time, they can create some real vulnerabilities.
It's like we've peeked behind the curtain to see the mechanics of it all.
So what's the big takeaway here?
Never stop learning. The market is always changing. What worked yesterday might not work tomorrow.
That's true for pretty much everything in life. Well, this has been an amazing conversation. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
The pleasure was all mine.
We've explored passive investing, uncovered some risks, and hopefully you're leaving with some new knowledge to make better decisions. Remember, the best investment is always in yourself. So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the world of finance.